Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We're just letting people join and get settled in. And we're a panelist down at the moment, but we're hopefully they'll be joining later. I'll be speaking anyway for a moment in time. So my name's Luke Piper. I'm head of policy at the 3 million. I'm going to be hosting tonight's event, but I'll go through some various housekeeping and things like that in due course. We are hoping to start in good time tonight. We're going to be starting with some little bit of discussion and things like that, and then moving on to other things. We will be broadcasting live on Facebook as well, and I'm just waiting for confirmation of that, and then we can make a start. So bear with me a moment. I'm just going to check a couple of things, and then we will be good to go. Okay. So we are live on Facebook. So hello again, and welcome to today's webinar on why EU citizens should have the option for physical proof of immigration status. So, as I said, my name is Luke Piper. I'm head of policy at the 3 million. And tonight we're going to be discussing how a lack of physical proof of status granted by the EU settlement scheme is one of the central concerns raised to the 3 million, indeed across the board. So the purpose of today's panel is to discuss the concerns of those these various people represent, and talk about the problems with a digital-only approach. We're also going to be exploring the issues and what the 3 million is working on as well to try and encourage physical documents being introduced. So a few housekeeping things. So first of all, if you've got any questions that you'd like to raise, there's a Q&A function where you can ask questions, and hopefully we'll be able to feed those into the discussion that we're going to be having later on. The next bit of housekeeping is that if you want to have a chat, use the chat function. It's there to be used, it's not a problem. We'll be putting some information in there as we go along with various links to various things. If you're a user of social media, then you can then use the hashtag #DenyMyBackup, and please don't forget to @ the 3 million. So Ian, thanks for joining. I'll be introducing you in a moment. But what we're going to do now is just play some videos from some people who've kindly done a couple of personal videos about why this issue of physical documents is important to them. And yeah, so we'll play those now. Sound's not working. I mean, a few technical problems. It was all working fine, and as ever with technology, it failed you.
About the whole thing for about a year. I got pre-settled status the first time I applied. I forgot about the whole thing for about a year until it was time to apply for settled status. So I logged onto the system and there was nothing there. They had absolutely no record of me ever applying, so I had to do the whole process again from the beginning. I have settled status now. Hopefully it's still online, but you never know. If I'd had to officially prove my status that first time, I wouldn't have been able to do that because there was absolutely no record of me on the system. However, if I'd had a card, for example, I could have taken it out of my wallet, shown it, and been on my way. It's so much faster. Technology breaks, it fails, but a physical proof of identification is always in your wallet, and we need it to avoid situations like what I had.
So we have a second video now, and this is from someone called Laurence. And then we'll go on to introduce our lovely guests.
Sorry, it's a bit of an issue.
It's okay. It's a really good one as well. That's why I'm really keen for people to see it, because it's really good. I'm not going to oversell it anymore, because if I oversell it anymore, people will be thoroughly disappointed. But it's good.
We're just proving the point about how fabulous digital systems are.
Yeah, exactly.
Last year, I had to get my settled status in order to continue to work and live here legally. Having gone through it successfully, I have no physical proof. This is a serious problem, especially for somebody like me who's a freelancer, because I'm going to have to prove over and over again now that I have the right to live and work here. I'm going to have to go online, enter my passport number, wait for a new screen, enter my birth date, wait for another new screen, have them generate a code, wait for the code to arrive on my phone, enter the code onto the website, then I can see my status. Then I'm going to have to request a link for an employer by entering in their email address and entering it in twice. And I can't do this 5, 6, 7 times a week for each individual employer that I'm working for an hour or two. I have a passport that proves my nationality and that I can travel. I have a driver's license that proves I pass a test and I can drive. I have a union card that shows I'm a member of a union. And yet, for the most important status that I have, the settled status that gives me the right to live and work here, I have nothing. Nothing except something that exists in a vague cyberspace that I may or may not be able to access, depending on the Wi-Fi. I need a physical backup. I need proof.
Told you, it didn't disappoint. So so thanks very much for those who have done some videos. We've got loads more, which we'll be putting out on social media and various other platforms as we go over the next few weeks. Feel free to do your own, send it in. We're always interested to hear other people's point of view on this issue. So now, turning to our panel of speakers. Tonight we've got 4 people who are going to briefly introduce the issue from their point of view, and then we will go into a discussion. So the first person that's going to speak is Monique Hawkins, who's a volunteer at the 3 million since 2016. She predominantly works in policy with me. Then we have Emily McCarran, who's the Equalities and Human Rights Policy Manager at Age UK. And then we'll be hearing from Ian Robinson, who's a partner at Fragaman, which is a solicitor's firm. They specialise in immigration. And then we will finish with Ollie Percy, who is a barrister at the Public Law Project. So over to you, Monique.
Oh, good evening, and thank you, Luke. Yes, so I'm going to just talk about the facts around proving status, really, and why we're doing this campaign. So firstly, to discuss when you need this proof. I mean, we need to prove status in lots and lots of places in the UK because of the hostile environment policies that the government introduced. So you need to prove it to be able to rent, to work, to access healthcare, to study, to make sure you get UK fees and not international fees, to access social security, entering the UK, boarding a plane when you're somewhere else. There's a whole host of places where you need to prove status. So how do we prove our status? Well, for Brits, they can show a British passport. For non-EU citizens, they get a little plastic card that they can use to prove status. But for EU citizens, from the 1st of July next year, it'll be purely a digital status. And it's very important to explain this is a completely big bang moment from the 30th of June to the 1st of July, because up to the 30th of June, employers and landlords are not allowed to check for your status. They're not allowed to ask you for it. So your EU passport should still suffice. And then from the 1st of July, this digital status is all you've got and everybody has to ask for it. So it's really quite terrifying. So quite apart from the sort of anxiety side, there's an awful lot of practical reasons for why a digital only system doesn't isn't enough. So I'm just going to share my screen here for just a moment, because I've kind of visualized this as a system of different moving parts, and you need every single part to work. And if any one of these things fails, the entire check will fail. So just to very briefly talk you through the points. So firstly, the applicant needs access to their passport, not just their passport, but the passport that was linked to the status. So if you get your status now with your current passport and you update that, or you renew your passport in 7 years' time, you have to remember to go back to the settled status scheme and update that. If you don't remember that, you merrily carry on with your new passport. When you then come to access your status, it won't work if you put in that new passport number, if you've forgotten to do that bit of maintenance. So that's number one. There's also people, there'll be vulnerable people who actually will struggle to have access to their passport, but okay. Then secondly, you need to have access to the email and mobile number that were originally linked to the status. And this is where I think is almost one of the biggest dangers, because this can cause a real physical separation between the holder of the status and the proof of that status. Because there are people who are not very digitally literate who are at the moment getting organizations to help them get the status. So they will, if the person themselves, the EU citizen, doesn't have an email address or a mobile phone, the organization will very helpfully put it against their email address and phone number. But if, several years down the line, you need to prove that status, you're really stuck. I can equally think of parents now who are registering their baby. They're obviously going to put that against the parent's email address and phone number. If that baby grows up and in 18 years' time needs to prove their status, will they be able to do that? Will they know what was linked to it? Thirdly, of course, you need to have access to the internet. Lots of times when you can't get on the Wi-Fi, there's no 4G signal, it's very stressful. The government websites need to be up and running. We've had several cases already where the government websites are down for maintenance, or there's a problem, just not acceptable for something as important as status. And then finally, the government databases, if you can reach all of them, they need to be correct. So we've seen in one video already where somebody's pre-settled status simply wasn't there. We've seen an example of somewhere where the status came up and said photograph not available, or your right to work not available. So there's just lots and lots of vulnerabilities there, which is why we just need a backup. And just briefly, that even the government actually agrees with us, even though they won't give us this this physical backup, because they did an assessment of a digital right to work trial, and this trial was run for non-EU citizens who have a physical backup, but they were doing a digital check trial, and the official assessment came back and said there is a clearly identified user need for the physical card at present, and without strong evidence that this need can be mitigated for vulnerable, low digital skill users, it should be retained. And it concluded saying digital by default doesn't mean 100% digital. There's a similar conclusion in the Science and Technology Committee, who wrote a digital government report, also said the government should also ensure that those who are not digitally connected have alternative ways of accessing services. And Michael Gove himself was asked in Select Committee about physical proof, and he said he agreed that there was a need for physical proof and said the moral and social case for it remains as strong as ever. So just to reiterate, we are not trying to change the system, get rid of it. We are asking for a physical backup. Thank you.
Thanks, Monique. So now we're going to hear from Emily at Age UK. Emily, I'm terribly sorry, but you're
No.
Now you're unmuted. Thank you.
I'll start again. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me tonight on the webinar. Yeah, look, there are about 110,000 people aged 65 and over who we believe need to apply to the EU settlement scheme. There's probably more, given that the data isn't always correct, and that many of these older people will have limited digital capacity. Sometimes also, as people get a lot older, maybe a degree of cognitive impairment, you know, if they're experiencing something like dementia. I guess one of the first barriers to the scheme we know is the fact that it has been mostly a digital application scheme. So about half the numbers of older people are applying to the scheme as younger people. And, you know, given that kind of issue, that hurdle, we're then kind of quite concerned about the online status issue as well. One of the main reasons we believe for the low application rate to the scheme is that although there has been an increase in internet usage by older people over the last decade, there are still just over half of people aged over 75 who don't use the internet. And I think the figure for people aged 65 and over who have never used it is about 3.4 million people. And then there's also a category of older people who, about 500,000 of them, who are what we call lapsed users. So they might have used it in the past, but they haven't used the internet for about 3 months. And from our research as well, we know that older people tend to use the internet in different ways than their younger counterparts. So they tend to use it for things like emailing, finding information, maybe reading the newspapers, sometimes internet banking and, you know, messaging. But it's essentially a different kind of usage. We also know about 93% of households in Great Britain have internet access, but access is lower amongst older households, particularly where there's one person aged 65 and over. So we know only about 73% of households with one adult aged 65 and over has no internet access. And also figures with regard to smartphones, I think nearly all young adults in the UK use a smartphone, but only about 3 out of 10 people aged over 75 and over do so. And, you know, we're sort of quite concerned that, you know, this combination of kind of lack of access to the internet, but also even when people do have the internet, that their limited digital capacity will make it harder for older people to access the online status granted to them, and therefore that will kind of, you know, the consequences of that will be quite profound in terms of limiting people's access to benefits, healthcare, and renting and other services. I mean, just as in terms of a deterrence as well, we've done some research on older people accessing housing benefit, and we kind of know that there is a great kind of deterrence element of kind of where an application is done online. You know, that the rates of application significantly drop. So, you know, and then there's a kind of separate category of older people that, you know, the kind of much older people, also older people who are lacking mental capacity or have fluctuating mental capacity. So those people with dementia and other cognitive impairments, their ability to as well apply to the scheme as well, but also to prove their online status will be significantly made much more difficult if it's only an online status process. So yeah, those are the kind of main things. I mean, essentially, I think those videos at the beginning kind of illustrated the way in which kind of, you know, people who, those two cases seem to kind of regularly use the internet, but they were describing the kind of massive issues they were kind of facing. But if you think about the experience of someone who has never used the internet, doesn't have a smartphone, doesn't even have the, you know, access to the internet, it's a significant problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And now over to you.
Thank you. So in a way, I think that Emily just made the case for physical documents stronger than anyone could really. It is. I do worry about what will happen with particularly older people who don't regularly use the internet. I've been asked to talk about give a perspective on behalf of employers and talk a bit about what happens elsewhere in the world. I'd start by saying that the policy thinking by the Home Office is clear and it's understandable. They want to move to digital status for the reasons that they give around security, around efficiency and so on. It's also where the world is going. But, and actually in most cases, the technology is good, but it misses the point in various ways. So firstly, you can understand why people wouldn't feel secure. You can understand why it feels incomplete as a policy where there are no real guarantees or securities for people when the system goes down. What happens if I'm waiting for medical treatment, if I'm trying to rent a flat and the system isn't working? How will I be protected? But also, how will the person who's renting me the flat? Also, it just feels, and I'll put this in the context of Australia later on, it feels slightly rushed, I would say. From an employer's point of view, then, if you're a large employer recruiting lots of people, getting them in through the door, checking right to work all the time, it's essentially an extra line in the process. Arguably, in some cases, a slower line, but you make that work. If you're a smaller employer, then you're in an entirely different world. How do you know that this or even exists? How do you know that you can trust it? How do you know what to do if the system goes down and if you can take a risk on the person who swears blind that they have the right to be here and maybe they were born here, apart from anything else. Maybe you've known them since they were a child. But also, how can you as an employer, or how can policy protect against the risk of inadvertent illegal working where it's not normal for a person to have their status checked online. For the first 6 months of next year, it will be enough for an employer just to see a passport. They won't need to see a check online that a person has status or see a visa. If you don't know that such a thing as digital status exists as an employer, if you don't as an employee, there's a very real risk that you recruit someone in good faith and they are inadvertently living and working in the UK illegally, and further down the line they get caught. Now, these issues, I should say, these issues for elderly people, I can see the numbers being substantial. For employers and employees, they may be smaller. But I used to work for the Home Office, and you always wanted policy to work for most people, accepted it wouldn't work for everyone, but that's where Ollie comes in, and that's where the courts come in. What isn't properly understood by policymakers is, in the meantime, lives are ruined. We saw this with Windrush. I tend, having worked at the Home Office, to be a Home Office supporter, but on this one, it's just common sense to me that you make a physical document available. It seems indefensible not to. There are also issues overseas. So one of our clients struggled to get into Russia. They held settled status, but Russia is very, very particular about requiring documents. Digital identity does not count as a document for that purpose. A colleague of mine who may actually be listening in was flying back, she's South African German, flying back from India, and was almost prevented from getting on the plane because the people at the airport in Bangalore didn't believe that such a thing as digital status for the UK existed. When she presented her German passport, they got confused about Brexit having happened. That's just two examples, but there will be many more. And what all of this calls for is more time and more consultation along with physical documents. So here we think about international examples. So we looked at 127 countries around the world. We were looking from a worker or a student perspective rather than humanitarian. But of those 127, only 6 countries allowed you to rely on, expected you to hold possibly a digital status. Of those 6 countries, and you had New Zealand, Colombia, Russia, America in there, only Australia insisted on digital statuses. And even then, in some instances, very narrow, you can get a physical document where, for instance, you're from a country where the Australians don't recognise your passport, essentially. But the Australian story is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, it largely worked well as a system, but where it doesn't work, there are protections that I'm not aware of in policy thinking for the UK, so that employers can act on faith and employ you while the system is down or while the system is providing the wrong information. They first rolled this out for a very small number of nationalities in 1996, a little bit more in 2004, a little bit more in 2012. And only since 2015 have they relied on digital only. But really importantly, that's an awful lot of time to get ready. When you look on the Australian website, they say in big clear letters, don't worry, everybody who works with the Australian system is familiar with the fact that you won't have a physical document. You don't need to worry. That's not true for the UK. And if you think about who needs to be consulted, who needs to understand it, and I'll finish after this. So the individuals need to know that this exists and is necessary, and that in itself is going to be really hard. But you've also got employers, you've got universities, you've got the airlines who will allow you on their flights, the airports who will allow you through security to get to the plane. You've got other governments who need to know that this is a status to let you in. A lot of governments, a lot of immigration authorities, sometimes regional, around the world. In the UK, you have, again, employers, but also landlords, DVLA, banks, if you want people to be able to open a bank account, and then the police as well, and then every other service provider. Like, it's really hard to educate one of those huge institutions or collections of institutions on this. It's difficult, if not impossible, to do that for all of them by what I suppose would be the end of the year, frankly. But I'll stop there if that's okay, Luke.
That's great. Thank you, Ian, for that insight. And finally, over to Ollie.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks to the 3million for having me. I am briefly going to speak to the equality law implications of digital-only status. I work at the Public Law Project, which is an NGO that represents people who experience poverty or other forms of discrimination. And we're a very strong image scheme generally, but digital status is one of our priority areas. And we have already been referred clients that make them particularly likely to have difficulties accessing digital-only status. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was referred a client who has a visual impairment, which means that he cannot read a screen. That client is going to have significant difficulty in accessing his status going forward. So I just wanted to talk about the 3 relevant protected characteristics that the characteristics that I think are most relevant under the Equality Act 2010, and then look at the other legal duties that apply to the government in relation to people who have specific disadvantages and may have difficulties accessing their status. So the Equality Act 2010 has a number of protected characteristics that it protects. So age, race, and disability seem to be the 3 most obvious protected characteristics in this arena. Emily has already spoken to the issue of age and to an extent to the issue of disability. As I mentioned, I've had a referral for a client who has a visual impairment that would be characterized as a disability under the Equality Act 2010. I've also heard of people with learning disabilities who have difficulties accessing digital status versus physical status. I'm also speaking to various Roma support groups who are concerned about their service users being able to access status, and that may engage the protected characteristic of race under the Equality Act. Now, what is the discrimination here? Well, there are broadly two types of discrimination, direct and indirect. And this isn't direct discrimination, but indirect, because it's a policy that seems neutral on its face, making everyone have digital status, but it disproportionately harms people with certain protected characteristics. So the example of age, people over 65 or 75 might be less likely to be have digital access. Therefore, while the policy doesn't only apply to them, it applies to everybody, but disproportionately affects them in a negative way. And it's of the Equality Act 2010. There's also the duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. And that's a duty that relates to disability. So, for example, with the client I mentioned just now, physical status might be a reasonable adjustment for that individual. It is worth noting that there are various exemptions to the Equality Act duties within the sphere of immigration, and you need to look very carefully at those exemptions when relying on the Equality Act. I don't have time to go into them in detail today. The other main pieces of sources of duty are the Human Rights Act 1998 and the withdrawal agreement itself between the UK and the EU. Now, for the purposes of the Human Rights Act, the type of discrimination is referred to as phlemenos discrimination. It's a form of indirect discrimination, but it's framed slightly differently. So the right that is engaged is Article 8, the right to private and family life, taken with Article 14, the prohibition on discrimination. Now, phlemenos discrimination says if you have different groups with different needs, treating them the same can constitute discrimination. And that might be the form of discrimination in play here. Under the withdrawal agreement, which there is an equal treatment provision, Article 23. So the requirement for digital status for EU citizens, but not other groups, might count as not equal treatment. But those the relevant provisions are not enforced until the end of the transition period. We have heard that there is a policy equality statement to the scheme, but none of us have seen it. It was referred to in a Northern Irish permission decision that came out towards the end of last year. So we know that there is a policy equality statement produced by the Home Office that considers these issues of equality law in relation to digital only status. And specifically, we know it considers disability because the judgment from the Northern Irish Court says so. We're trying hard to get hold of it, and we'll keep you posted on our progress. And I think that's all I have to say.
Great. So thanks everybody for contributing that real range of insight from that. Monique talking about how if one cog fails, the whole thing fails. Emily's really clear insight into the potential big risk for those of a certain age demographic. Really valuable insight from Ian, which we very rarely get in these sorts of circles, is hearing that perspective from a more Home Office perspective and his experience in that. And then Ollie's excellent legal insight, explained very, very well, I have to say, on the potential equalities issues. So we've got a nice blend of political, policy and legal insight. So we're going to move on to discussion now, which is informed by questions that have been sent in before. Some of the questions that people have posted, they're not identical. I have taken some creative license, I will not lie, but I'm hoping that we will be able to flesh out more really some of the points that we're touching on today. Followed by that, there'll be a bit of closing where you're going to hear me explain what more can be done. What can people do to help in trying to achieve that goal of arranging and encouraging Parliament to, or even Home Office, to give people that option of a physical document. But the first question and discussion point that I'd like to go to is why do we think that this is such a hot topic, and why are people so anxious and have such little faith in the workings of the Home Office? Much of the comments that have been posted now, the questions that have been put in the chat, the many things that have been sent to me have all been embedded in this concern of fear, anxiety, worry. And before we go into that, I'd like people to answer this poll question, which you're already filling in at such great breakneck speed, just to find out what people want. Do they want a digital only? Do they want just a physical card, or do they want both? So please fill that in so we can get a bit of an insight. I think we all know where this is going to go, but this is just helpful to kind of give it a feel. So going up, and we know that it's going to be both, isn't it? I mean, well, of course it is. But I'll let that continue whilst the slow people take the rest of it. But as I was saying, it creates a lot of emotion, this issue. So first thing for the panel to talk about is, why do they think that is? Where does it come from? What's the attachment to these physical documents? And the result of that poll is that yes, people want both. So Monique, would you like to start on why you think there's such a strong emotion around this issue?
Well, I mean, as an EU citizen myself, because I'm Dutch, I'm now dual national, I experienced like quite a traumatic reaction after the referendum, and I think it's the combination of that sort of 4-year period that we've had, where we've gone from sort of broad assurances saying, of course, there's not going to be anything, you'll automatically get the rights that you are entitled to. I don't know, I just think there's a real lack of trust that's built up there. I think there's a distrust about big data projects in general, not just the Home Office, but sort of government. And like the NHS, we're going to do a great big database thing, and that got cancelled. So I think that's just a general thing. I think Windrush has really spooked people. I think it's really the combination of all of those.
Yeah, and that's, it's this sort of building, it's this building up momentum, isn't it? It's that feeds into that, and that kind of trust is in reach, but it keeps going further away because of events that happen in politics. Ollie, you are a well-seasoned lawyer. You must have insight into why you think people are so nervous about this whole thing too.
I mean, I probably actually have less insight than most people about this. I think what Monique says is probably informed by all the people that he's spoken to. What might provide some reassurance is actually seeing the policy equality statement that I mentioned earlier, and that we haven't seen that is a concern.
So I suppose it's that the question is building trust. So because there is this feeling, and it seems to be rooted in issues of trust, and we're all sort of nodding our heads to the idea of that. So what do we feel that the Home Office, or the government more generally, could do to build trust around this issue, other than obviously giving physical documents? But it does seem to kind of strike at a bigger point. Ian, I dare to ask you, but what do you think the Home Office could do more to encourage trust in these systems?
Well, it's funny actually, because I was thinking, I used to really irritate my wife because I didn't have internet banking, which was largely laziness, to be honest. But we don't worry about internet banking. We trust that implicitly, but that's because Barclays haven't made the mistakes that the Home Office have in the past, such as Windrush. I must say that the The department shouldn't solely be characterised by Windrush, the team working on settled status, really good. The work permit team, one of the best in the world. But Windrush cuts so deep and is so awful that you can understand why it remains fresh in people's memory. The thing, there is a good case for digital status as an option. It's, in theory, harder to lose, but I say that having lost lots of passwords in my life for other online tools. It's harder to exploit people. It's more secure. It should be harder to forge, one would imagine. Lots of cases, but until we can get to a point where you can look at this and think, actually, my auntie who's in her 80s and blind and lives on her own, mine not being European, but still, that she would be able to use it. It's hard to get around your head around how you can manage without a physical document. I have less sympathy for regular work permit holders. I do take the point that the lady made at the beginning as a freelancer who has to present it often, but it is really for vulnerable groups. They have to be given that choice because it will drive them mad. In terms of faith in the Home Office, there has to be a more open dialogue. There has to be a more honest dialogue. Frankly though, when we have this sort of media that we've had recently over the small boats, the Home Office doesn't come across as the most sympathetic of departments, and that will make sceptical people find it even harder to relate. In the defence of officials, because many of my friends, I mean, they will share many of the values of the people on this panel, but and they will want to implement things in the right way. They will want to do the right thing, but it will be hard to win confidence with that backdrop, frankly. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it was really helpful, Ian. And I suppose, Emily, as AGK has, I was in one of your charity shops over the weekend, so it's a big feature in my life. But I often hear, particularly from family members of older people, how they're really worried about their relatives, and indeed a lot of the things that have come in through the chats and the messages before have been from family members, and I wanted to kind of understand maybe a bit more, because you explained so well about the kind of digital disenfranchisement, but if you had anything else to add about this sort of fear around digital and particularly around status from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the heart of this matter, the fear comes from the fact that, you need this status to prove your entitlement or ability to get really kind of core services and kind of to access kind of important kind of, different parts of life, employment, rent, healthcare is a key thing. Also access to other benefits, access to social care. And I think, for older people, they already are experiencing kind of lots of hurdles to accessing these sorts of things. I mean, not even to mention the issues arising out of the pandemic and lockdown, and how that's just made life a lot harder for many older people. So then to, add this really significant hurdle, which many older people are simply not equipped to kind of, overcome, is really frightening. And I guess, in the background, is what happened to those people kind of caught up in the Windrush scandal. And I know there are kind of very different issues there to do with kind of historical racism and so on. But, I guess that is fresh in people's minds, and it makes people frightened. And it's just, it's a big deal because it relates to very important kind of parts of our lives that we need support and be able to participate in everyday life.
So moving on to kind of another thing to talk about, is touches on something that was discussed before, and it relates to the goal, the end game of having a digital status. And obviously everyone's concerns and anxieties stem around, what if it gets hacked? What if it goes wrong? What if it breaks, etc.? And these things happen. But, you know, the government want to achieve this. Other countries are going in that direction. But what needs to be in place to make sure that this move works? You know, having physical proof as a backup, having all of those things there to ensure that people are safe is important. But what are the kind of safeguards that need to be in place? And I think one of the main things, and this is what Ian touched on very helpfully, is that Australia had a very long transition period over which people were able to migrate into a digital system. Granted, Ian also touched on some very important points about how Australia is very different to the UK in terms of its immigration control, but they still, this idea of transitioning was really, really important. And we're going to do another poll now of how long a transition period should we have if we're going to move to a digital only option. People will notice that I didn't put none at all, because I'm not going to give in to that kind of option. But it just wanted to get a feel for how long people feel would be the right kind of length of time to move from this current way of doing things to a future way of doing things. And then I'm going to briefly explain what the transition is that there's in place now. So what is the transition that the UK is going to do into the digital only approach for EU citizens? It might surprise you. So we're close to the results there. It's I think everybody can see this as it's going along. No, they can't. So it's just me talking to myself. That just looks terrible, doesn't it? So it's just me. It's going up. It's going down. It's doing lots of things. But, so the poll has ended. We share the results have been shared. So surprise! It's 10 years. So currently, the transition from this in the UK from the current physical document methodology to the digital only is 0. There will be 0 days, 0 months, 0 years between physical and going digital only. The grace period that we will be entering into for 6 months after the end of this year, employers are still going to be required to just accept physical passports, and that will end at the end of June. So that's when it will go live digital only. So it's a bit startling, but what I was hoping the panel could talk a bit about now is, other than a really nice long transition, what other safety mechanisms, so we've got long transition, physical documents, what other things should be in place to ensure that digital only can work better? And we'll start with, we'll go with you, Ollie.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. The two that have been mentioned are the two most obvious ones, and I generally don't get any habit of giving the government more ideas. I mean, proper piloting is always an option, and we had a proper beta testing process with the EU settlement scheme way back at the beginning, before it had full public rollout. So that is one other option, but I guess that's a sort of subsumed within the transition period option, possibly.
Monique, what do you think?
Well, when I was researching this last year, I came across a study from the Netherlands that was actually really interesting, because they ran a trial to introduce digital identity, and they did it in collaboration with Delft University. They used far more secure technology. It was based on blockchain and stuff, and I mean, this goes to what Ollie was saying about piloting. They tested it in 2 municipalities with a voluntary test group of citizens and a voluntary group of service providers. But the most interesting thing was that they said after the scheme, I'll just have to read this out, that the scheme will be subjected now to scientific research to explore the social, ethical, technological, legal, economic and consumer aspects. The results will form the basis for determining whether and how the idea should be pursued. I mean, that's what I call a pilot scheme. It's actually just looking at whether it is okay to do this. Whereas instead what we're getting here is no engagements with groups like us. I mean, one of the conclusions from the Windrush, the Wendy Williams Windrush report, was that there should be more engagement. We've not even been able to get through the door to try to explain to the Home Office what our concerns are. So, I think that contributes to the frustration and the distrust and the... So, a proper pilot is my answer, like Ollie's.
Good. And Ian, given your considerable background and expertise in policy insight, what do you think? If there's anything in addition to what we talked about?
I definitely have a background. I'm not sure I've got expertise. So I would say, firstly, it's interesting that you're struggling to speak to the Home Office about this, because they would normally be very good at consulting stakeholders, although I appreciate it's not always as easy for civil society as employers. So my thinking very quickly is, firstly, we've jumped to the assumption that digital only is the answer. I think that digital is the future. I think they have to do that. They cannot run their business relying on documents that can be forged. It's not efficient for them. It's too expensive. Loads of reasons why digital is the future, but digital should be the future for 95% of people, 90%, I don't know, but not everyone. For all the reasons Emily gave, you have to have the physical option. There will need to be controls around that, but you do need it. More generally though, even if it's a mixed model, you still need, again, time, piloting, the sort of stuff we've talked about. You need defences for individuals and employers or other actors, so universities, landlords, etc., so that where the system goes down, in Australia, you're allowed to employ somebody if the system has gone down and you've made reasonable attempts to confirm their status, for instance. You need to be thinking about service standards where there are issues, services and service standards where there are issues with status. It can't be enough for Luke to log on and say, hang on a minute, I do have leave, or I am allowed to work, but the status doesn't say anything. And then you're in limbo for 3 months. It should be a quick turnaround for them to correct these things. You then need real-time updates on effectiveness of the system. If there are issues, there needs to be transparency around those issues, and people need to know. And as part of that messaging, it needs to be clear what individuals, employers, etc., can do, service providers, doctors, if the system is down, and what they can rely on. And then there needs to be full education and training for all of the different players, whether that is the DVLA, a police station in Slough, a hospital in Wakefield, an airport in Bangalore, etc. So there's an awful lot. So if you, there are an awful lot of areas where things can go wrong. It doesn't matter how good the IT system is. And then finally, and I'll stop because I said a lot there, there has to be proper scrutiny, scheduled scrutiny, so that 30 years from now, we don't need a new Wendy Williams report. I genuinely believe, I'm in this slightly schizophrenic place where I am constantly defending the Home Office while occasionally moaning about them, maybe not constantly defending. I genuinely believe that there isn't a person in the Home Office who would want what happened to those people to happen ever again. But there need to be checks and balances. There will be recommendations, as there are in Wendy Williams' report. But if this status is going to be rolled out, especially if it's to everybody, including non-Europeans, an annual report or an annual review of effectiveness, where the impact that it's had on people's lives, even if it's a tiny number of people, they are people who, innocent people who have done nothing in their lives or have been potentially ruined. You have to have that sort of scrutiny. I imagine that would be independent. It might be through a select committee, but you've got to have that sort of scrutiny. I think somebody on the question has just asked me if the Home Office buys me sweets, so I'll take a look at that question. Go on mute.
I think that they do, Ian. I think I find your input very frank, honest, and open. And I think it's actually really, really refreshing to have it. One thing I was going to add before Emily passing on to you. I think any digital system, and this links with what you're saying, Ian, I think any digital system that's going to go forward has to be compliant with people's data rights. It must be. And for me, never mind people getting the physical backup to support it, any digital system going forward needs to protect those fundamental data rights. And it's very much a sort of area of law that's growing and developing, but we need to make sure that there is compliance there. And a big part of that is transparency from the Home Office. And it's everyone's hope that we will have a deeper understanding of transparency within the Home Office, but compliance with those fundamental principles, GDPR, etc., is a central canon, and being held accountable against those is also really, really important, I think. Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm the person to be designing up the kind of right scheme, but one thing that is apparent, when you think of banking, shops, banking is moving to an online format, and certainly lots of issues with bank closures for older people. But at the same time, there's still that mixed model. You have a credit card, you have a bank card, you can, for the most part, still go into a physical bank location. It's the same with shops. There are, increasingly kind of online ways to operate. But at the end of the day, in those spheres, there's still this mixed model. So, I think that also needs to apply to this, and particularly given the fact that we know a significant number of people just will not be able to use that digital model. So I think in terms of a transition period, it needs to be kind of much longer. I think, there's bigger questions about the way that policy is designed, and perhaps, I won't go into kind of all the legal stuff, but the public sector equality duty, there's arguments about, whether that's strong enough. And, but I often wonder, and I've kind of, this is just a personal thought, I've kind of thought about kind of the, responses to COVID and that pandemic, but, I'm not always kind of sure whether policymaking is always focused on kind of equalities to begin with, in terms of assessment, but actually indeed even people. And I know that sounds kind of rather cynical, but I just wonder if there's a lot of focus on systems and kind of savings and how this will impact on other government departments or other kind of areas of policy. And I think we've kind of just probably need to go back a bit more with policy making to kind of really, really have a better understanding of the impact on different protected characteristic groups, and indeed just different, individuals. Because at the moment, this is really, it's going to, have a really significant impact on the lives of, a big number of people. So, yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Emily. I think one thing I'm taking from this is, the end game of a digital-only approach seems very, very far out of reach for all the reasons that we've been talking about. And I think we're probably not going to get there. But if we do get pushed into it, which seems to be the direction of travel at present, it's going to present some quite serious problems, both practically politically, legally, and it's really something that we all need to be mindful of. I'm going to move on to another point of discussion now. And we're getting so many questions. I'm really sorry we're not going to be able to cover them. What I'm trying to do is fold so much of what people are asking into the question and discussion that we're having today. There's also lots of questions about what can we do, etc., which I will address at the end. But the next topic that we want to go to is to let you know that we, the 3 million, have commissioned a poll in relation to EU freedom of movement ending. Now, the poll asks questions to employers across all the different sectors in the UK, various sizes, and we will intend to publish some material on this really, really soon, because there's some really, really interesting stuff that we've managed to get from the poll. But one of the relevant takeaways for tonight was that nearly 1 in 5 employers had a preference for physical proof of status instead of digital. And that preference increased to 1 in 4 amongst those who had experience of the digital check service. So just say we've got 1 in 5 employers saying they would prefer to have physical status instead of digital, and that preference increased when we looked at those who had experience of the digital system to 1 in 4. So the question that I was going to put here was to say, what do we think this potentially tells us about the attitudes towards a digital-only system and their potential impact on EU citizens? So I'm going to ask Monique first of all, because she's probably had more time to think about it than the rest of you. So Monique, please, after you.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with a lot of what Ian says, that I can see why employers rather than landlords are happy to try digital, especially in the abstract, because they want to be sure that they're not caught up in these employing someone they're not allowed to, because I don't know if everybody on the webinar knows, but the consequences for them are sort of really, really severe. I mean, they can face up to £20,000 fine and prison sentences if they do that. So, at the moment it's all very complicated. There's so many different types of things they could check, and so in the abstract they're thinking, great, make it digital, make it simple. But even then, a 20% preference for digital shows what impact that can have on EU citizens. I mean, that could mean that 1 in 5 EU citizens trying to get a job at one of these places could potentially face discrimination, which is really hard to prove on a case-by-case basis, because how can you prove that you were discriminated against for that and not because the other person was a better candidate? I mean, it's just really difficult, isn't it? And I'm quite interested about the fact that it goes up for those who've had experience of it, because it kind of shows that although people maybe like the idea in the abstract, that actually when it comes down to it, it's still maybe a bit fiddly and clunky. And yeah, so I'm worried, despite the fact that there are there's quite a few people who are employers who are happy with digital. I am worried that 20% is still pretty high, and there's quite a lot of grief potentially coming down the line.
Thank you. Ollie, one of the things that I was thinking about is, what do you think that this potentially tells us about the potential consequences for EU citizens? Because if such a ratio of employers have a preference towards it, would that impact on the potential situations for EU citizens who are looking for work or in the job market when they face these employers who have this preference towards a towards a physical approach?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a detailed breakdown of the statistics. So with that caveat, yeah, it's a concern. And I echo what Monique has said. It may increase the likelihood of EU citizens being refused. And got to remember that this digital the first thing that I thought about when I read those stats in the email that you sent me earlier, Luke, was the parallel with the right to rent litigation that JCWI brought. And for those of you who are not familiar with that case, JCWI undertook a series of mystery shopper exercises and showed that the right to rent scheme on its face disadvantaged certain groups of people. Now, when you start adding in a hurdle that employers or landlords don't like on top of that, we may see sort of a turbocharge of discrimination. So there might be that initial discrimination between EU citizens and British citizens. That might be a view held by prospective landlords and employers. When you add a sort of difficult barrier for them to treat the two groups equally, then there's the potential for that discrimination to be exacerbated, because it's not just appealing to prejudice, it's appealing to laziness, not wanting to go through that complex hurdle to sort of check whether that person is eligible. So in answer to your question, yet the statistics are a concern. It's hard to know what preference means from the basis of the question. Like, are they going to refuse because they slightly prefer physical to rather than digital? It's hard to say from the framing of the question. But anything that has the risk of putting a barrier in place when there might be a sort of a discriminatory agenda at the back of someone's mind already is a real concern.
Great, thank you, Ollie. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with statistics, you know, you ask the question and it's often people come to it in different ways with different points of views and different interpretation, and equally the results we can do that with. Ian, I wondered what your take on it was, particularly that difference, if there's anything that we might be able to take from that. Yeah. You're on mute, Ian. I'm sorry. I thought you were thinking very carefully then, Richard.
I think that what I take from it is that it doesn't surprise me that there would be a preference. I imagine that 20% would diminish it as people became more familiar, but equally, I think it's entirely feasible that people will be denied services, jobs, etc., if they are not by employers who do not trust or are not familiar with digital status. I don't think that's a reason not to allow digital status again. I think digital status is a good thing. It just needs to be backed up by a physical document. But that risk the likelihood of that risk being realised is higher the less time that you give people to prepare for it, and the less transparency or less information there is available to people who are ultimately taking the decision to provide a service, to employ, and so on, and decisions that we mustn't assume these are small. It may be a small decision for the employer to offer a job. It's a hell of a big opportunity for the individual that could be lost, or it could be worse if it's healthcare and so on. If you're stuck in India because you're not allowed back on a flight, if you are unable to rent a flat, and so on, and I think this is. And Luke will come to this later, I believe, but it's part of the argument with the Home Office for, firstly, more time, and secondly, the physical option. It's one part of a much bigger argument. Data is always helpful, of course, but data, as Ollie put beautifully, can be used in all sorts of directions. But it's certainly part of that.
Great. We've well, I'm just checking time. I'm actually okay. I was Emily, if you've got anything you'd like to add to any of those observations before we move on to our sort of final headline.
Yeah, just really briefly, I mean, I think what that figure shows is that there's, you know, a broad group of people are quite worried about this. Employers, you know, it's not, you know, actually, I think kind of from a policy perspective, you know, at Age UK, we do lots of work on bank closures, and it's quite difficult actually, because I think many people now fully support, you know, online and internet banking, and it's a smaller and smaller group of people who want to retain actual kind of physical banks and whatnot. But this is, you know, shows that actually employers are worried about it too, and they're kind of worried about the consequences. And I think just to kind of finish up that, you know, this that runs the risk in that setting of exacerbating already existing kind of prejudices or the risk of discrimination, indirect discrimination, that, you know, that people kind of might face in accessing employment. And I'll finish there.
Great, thank you, Emily. So we've got last 10 minutes before I wrap up and talking about some other points. Now, unsurprisingly, people are getting very animated about this topic, which is fine and is totally what I'd probably be doing. But what I wanted to end on, and this is one of the things that I've seen actually a couple of times popping up in the questions in the chat, is why are the government doing this? Why? What? I mean, I'm not expecting anybody to actually know the answer, but a wild guess. Why they are so insistent on driving forward this digital only mass conversion of over 3 million people into it? Why do we think that there's such an urgency to do it? And I'm gonna pick on Ollie again because you're not muted. So
cool. I'm not a mind reader, but the Home Office has repeatedly described the EU settlement scheme as the pilot for future immigration systems. We've seen a number of innovations, for example, the level of automation in the application process to the EU settlement scheme, and actually that was probably quite good because it was a shorthand for people to come to prove their continuous residence. So this has always been the system that the Home Office was very proud of and saw it as the pilot for all future immigration systems. And that thinking has continued from the application process to the proof of status. And that is why, in my opinion, they seem to be so insistent on digital-only status. They're very proud of the scheme. They think it's going to work.
great. So what I'm looking at here is there's some questions that have been upvoted, and actually some of them are really quite straightforward. So I'm going to start with top of the pops. I think I'm learning how to do this right. And one of them, I think it's quite a straightforward one. So we've got two lawyers. I'm a lawyer, but I'm pretending not to be one today. Two here and Ollie. Can we lose our status if we forget to update our details? So it means like the passport, etc. Who'd like to answer that one?
One thing I need to say is that you're pretending to not be a lawyer. I am not pretending to be a lawyer. I'm a partner in a law firm, but I'm not a solicitor. No, you do not lose your status if your passport is not updated, but it will make other things more complicated. Can I just answer quickly the question on why the Home Office is insisting? Because it's really clear to me it's cheaper to run this system, which is important. That's not about being cheap. It's more secure, prevents abuse. Operationally, it's easier, especially when they wouldn't have the capacity to knock out 4 million BRPs through the DVLA. Efficiency will be higher, so will quality. There'll be fewer touch points, so less room for error, less room for operational problems like dispatch and so on, and also a push towards government services. There are very strong and compelling reasons why the government should want digital status. Again, it doesn't excuse lack of physical documents for those who need them, but it's not something that they're doing to be mean. There are good operational reasons. The other reason that they are insisting on it is because they don't have a good enough reason not to insist on it. Which is why actually Luke and the 3 million or so and what they do. I've never known a campaigning group to have such an immediate and powerful impact on government decision making as the 3 million did when you arrived back in 2016, I guess it would have been. But that government will do what they're doing until they have a good reason not to, frankly. Sorry,
Excellent.
I was slightly worked up when I was thinking about that.
No, and it's purely, I should have let everybody speak to that particular issue, but I got sidetracked by the number of people voting for these questions to be moved up. But that really valuable insight, and thank you for the promo there. One of the questions that people are asking is if we can take the government to court over this matter. I think Ollie has alluded to the scope of where there's potential issues, but I don't think any of us can speak now to the prospects or the merits. But you know, there are some questions. There are some legal questions that we can that can be the answer to this. But you know, we won't go into the nitty-gritty of that. And I'm just going to just go through a few more, if that's okay. Okay, well, you know, there's some here that okay. So there's somebody who's expressed some concern here about interaction with NHS services. So they said there's a serious health issue and they've used the NHS extensively and are on their records as a patient. Am I to assume that from July 2021, I may be turned away from hospital? Should there be a problem proving my settled status? So who would like to put this person's fears at rest about how the overseas charging people do their thing? Ollie, you're scowling, which is never a good sign. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, actually, health policy isn't my area, but my understanding is that, and Luke, you might be able to kind of come in here as well about, you know, exactly what sort of access you can get. But I mean, emergency, you're not going to be turned away. I think as well as if you're registered with the GP, you're not going to be turned away. But I think it's for sort of more kind of planned, you know, operations that, you know, that are kind of, you know, coming up, or sort of non-emergency health care that falls outside of the GP. But I would need to check up on that. Look, I mean, Luke, you were telling me a story about someone who kind of, you know, someone who kind of registered overseas who was able to access healthcare, but then was footed with the bill. So that's something, I don't know if you can shed light on that.
Well, I think, you know, the cornerstone of accessing NHS treatment is that it's a residency-based system. And fundamentally, if you are ordinary resident in the UK and you are lawfully living here, then you are entitled to free NHS treatment. Now, with somebody who's got settled status, if they're ordinary residents, this is where they live, it's their home, they should be eligible to access the full, you know, range of services available. The issue that this person is alluding to is how they prove it. And the role of they call them overseas officers. I think they have some kind of sort of title, but some especially in the hospital whose job is to investigate the patients who come in and whether or not they're eligible. It's their job is to gather this information. Now, in truth, I don't know how it's going to work with the settled status system, but one thing I do know is that some of these officers do have the ability to connect with the Home Office and gather information for the purposes of ensuring that a person has the legal basis to be here. But they have an inquiry function. They don't just, stop and move on. There's a lot that they can do. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be one of those situations, where people are going to be turned away, particularly when things like emergency treatment are free and available at the point of use. So we've got 10 minutes, and I want to move on now. Sorry, to the next and final bit, which is what lots of other questions begin on. But before I do that, I just want to thank everybody on the panel for speaking. I think we've had some really, really nice ranged insight into the issues and the problems and the potential solutions, and how we can make status better, and why there's a very clear need for physical backup to the current settled status regime. But obviously we don't have physical backups, and at the moment the UK government is resistant to the idea. There has already been an amendment to a previous piece of legislation, which was passed in the House of Lords, where a physical document was included. But that was not passed, it was defeated in the Commons. So we are here again. There is another opportunity. There is a piece of legislation called in short, the Immigration Bill that's currently in the House of Lords. The purpose of this bill, this piece of legal instrument, is to bring freedom of movement to an end. Now, that is all that it does. It doesn't create any safe passages for people to get to their new status, but it's an opportunity to present arguments as to not only how we can make it safer for people to get their new status and things like that, but also it's an opportunity to, again, put the case for physical documents. And there are a series of members in the House of Lords who have tabled some amendments to introduce physical documents, and hopefully they will pass. The bill has been debated in detail on the 7th of September, and if an amendment is passed, it will then go back to the Commons for a debate and vote. Now, why am I telling you all of this, and the intricacies of parliamentary procedure, which is for a lot of people is very, very boring. The reason why I'm telling you this is because the focus and the attention of politicians when this immigration bill is being discussed and debated will be on these issues and why they're so important. And what we need people to help us get the message out there is to sign up to our newsletter. Now, the people who've already signed up to today's event, and we're going to send an email afterwards explaining what we're going to be doing and how they can help. If you know anybody else who wants to get involved, who wants to get more updates, more information about what is being done to get physical documents, then please go to the website, which the link will be in the chat function, and sign up, and you'll be receiving some emails. Now, in short, the strategy is that we need people to write to their local members of parliament, and we would like people to explain why this is such an important issue to them, and why physical documents should be given to EU citizens. We've produced a range of materials which you can find on the website explaining the arguments, much of what you've heard today. But when you sign up, we'll also be sending out some templates and specific helpful pieces of information that will enable you to do this simple task. Don't underestimate the power of letter writing. It tells your representative what you are concerned about. It's their job to represent your views in Parliament and to communicate them to the various people, and the more the merrier. Now, in addition to that, we'll also be talking about other ways that you can help out. There's other things that can be done, and we'll be explaining those in the emails that we'll be sending round. As Ian has said, and as such, very, very, I didn't pay him, I didn't give him any sweeties to say it. You know, we do have a voice in all of this. It's an important issue, and it's through collective pressure, it's collective voices that change can happen. It's happened before. We put the 3 million with others, put pressure on the government to scrap the fee, but for the pressure of organisations on the government, people would be paying £65 each, bit cheaper for kids, to get settled status. That was gotten rid of through the pressure of people getting involved and working together. It may feel like a million years ago, but back in the days when no deal was a risk, people writing letters and asking to vote on the Costa Amendment, which resulted in no deal guarantees essentially being galvanised around in the Commons, feels like a distant memory, and so much has changed since then. But again, that happened because people got together and put pressure on the government as a collective. There are good, solid arguments for why physical documents should be given to EU citizens. We've heard them today. They're not fantasy, they're not silly, they're serious, and they are good arguments. And by keep making those arguments from many, many voices, we can hopefully make that difference and see a change and introduction of physical documents. So please sign up. Finally, one last thing, we are running a crowdfunder. We're raising money to support our organisation, the 3 million. That money goes towards things like the poll I mentioned earlier. Now, I know I only mentioned one part of it. There's lots of other things in that poll which we'll be publishing, but polls and asking questions and doing that sort of thing, unfortunately, it costs money to instruct people to do that work. And there's other things, that overheads, that you'd be surprised that we have to cover as a small organisation. So if you can, please do donate what you can. The crowdfunder's been posted in the chat there, and you can click on that and read up. Finally, before I close, I just want to say thank you again for everybody who's spoken today with a really fantastic range of insight. Please do sign up, and we'll hopefully do more of these sorts of things on different issues, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.